In the last lecture, we styled our active links here. Now I want to fix the behavior that whenever I click one of these recipe icons here, we reload the page. And that simply happens if we have a look at our recipe list component, which of course is responsible for displaying the list. Here in the recipe item, which is the individual item we're clicking, we have a link with this ref attribute here. Let's remove it because that will actually send a request to the browser and therefore reload our page. If we remove this, you see now I can click it, but now we no longer got the cursor, which looks like a hand. We can quickly add this manually though by simply adding style and then cursor equal to pointer. And now we should have the pointer, which clearly indicates that we can click this, but now we don't reload the page anymore. Now for the drop down here, we should also make sure that all these links are not reloading the page, because right now they are. And that is something we have to fix in the recipe detail component. Here, we also need to remove these ref elements here. And I already added the style with the cursor, which is set to a pointer to the first anchor tag. Let's also add it to the other two. And with that, that should be fixed too. Now, if we select something here, we don't reload. Let's now also do that for the dropdown. Right now, clicking the dropdown also reloads the page. That, of course, has to be fixed in the header component. And here, we reload the page because our dropdown also has this anchor tag or this ref attribute on it. So we should get rid of this and then maybe also implement this style cursor pointer setup to get the right mouse cursor. Let's also do the same for the individual anchor tags inside of that dropdown. So I also removed ref there and added my own cursor style. So with that, this now all works fine. Of course, the dropdown doesn't do anything. We'll add this later, but the app is working again. And therefore we made a big step into the right direction. So with this all added and set up here, our root routes seem to be working fine. But now I want to change the way we load the recipe when we click on one here in the list. I actually want to load that via child routing. When we click new recipe, I also want to load the to be created recipe edit component here on the right, where we now have the detail component. And the same for the case that we click edit here. So that is something I definitely want to add. I want to add these routes, these child routes. So that is what we should work on next. As mentioned at the end of the last lecture, the next goal is to implement child routing for our recipe routes here. So that when we click a recipe here, we actually load it by adding, let's say, slash and then the ID of that recipe in our recipes array here in the URL. So recipes 1 would load the first element, or recipes 0 actually, since we started 0 in the array, and so on. So that would be great if we could load our recipes like that and render them here then. So with a child router again. And the same for new recipe and edit, but for that we will need a new component. Let's implement this in a second step. The first step should be to make these items clickable and load the detail component as a child route here in a new router outlet probably. We will also need another new component then for the case that we first visit our page. In this case, we should have a starting component which kind of says, please select a recipe. Something we right now do by displaying this template here in our recipes component, here the ng template, but that will then also be removed because all I want to have inside of this div with the callMD7 class here is our router outlet. So again, this is a challenge for you. Try implementing this child routing, or at least try to do the first steps of that, setting up the router, creating that component which basically says please select a recipe, and then loading either that component or the detail route, the detail component, depending on whether we click the recipe in the list or not. Certainly a challenge, but also something where you can practice a lot of the things we learned in the last lectures. Starting in the next lecture, we will do this together, so then you can see my approach on implementing this. So, were you successful? Here is my solution. As I said, I want to implement child routes. So I will do this by going to the app routing module here, and on my recipes, I'll add the children property. Now children also takes an array of routes, and each route still is just a JavaScript object. Here, the first route I want to have is the empty path, so that we just visit /recipes/nothing, the default case. Here I want to load that new component I was referring to, which will simply hold the text we have in this ng template for now. Now for this I will quickly create this component, and I'll use the CLI for that. With ng-gc I can generate a new component, and this component should now go into the recipes folder, so recipes, and then slash, and here you may simply choose that folder. So recipes, and I will name it recipe start, so the recipe start component. With spec false, I prevent this spec file from being generated. So with that, we got our recipe start component here. And as I mentioned before, all I will do is I will output here, maybe in a h3 tag now, please select a recipe. So really simple. With that set up, with our start component set up here, I now want to use that. It has been added to app module automatically by the CLI, so make sure that this is the case. And now in the app routing module, here, I will load this component. So the recipe start component, this one here. Make sure to add the import at the top from /recipes/recipe start component. And with that added, we got our first component, which can be displayed inside of our recipes component. Let's try this out, because that should be all we need to get started with it. In the recipes component, because again, this is, and that's important, this is the component, the recipe component here, is the component where our child routes are registered. So it is in this component's template that we need to provide a router outlet for the child routes to be rendered. So I will do this here. I will add a router outlet here. And when I save this with ngserve running, this looks pretty good. We see please select a recipe, and clearly that is not a paragraph anymore, so it seems to be our new component. Of course, if we click somewhere, that doesn't work anymore, because we only have the router outlet there. Our old logic of loading a recipe is completely broken, but we will restore it soon. Actually, we can already take the first step for restoring that functionality. I'll add another path here to the child routes of recipe component. That path should be :id. So a dynamic segment added after /recipes. That's of course something you have to keep in mind. All child routes always come after the path of the parent route. So all these routes here will have /recipes in front of it. So add /recipes/id, with id being a dynamic parameter. Here I want to load my recipe detail component. We also need to add the import to that component up here, of course. So from the recipes folder, then recipe detail, and then the recipe detail component file. With that, we now at least have a route which would allow us to load this component. And we can kind of see this in action if we manually enter 1 here, let's say. It tries to load the recipe detail component. Of course it will break, because there we try to output data which we no longer get, because our old logic of transferring data from the list item to the detail component doesn't work anymore. But we'll fix it, and we'll actually start fixing it in the next lecture.